Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western Literary Canon out loud. So today I am finishing up the rest of The Will to Power. I said in a previous video that we were doing it in that video, but as time went on, I started to become concerned that I was going to run out of audio space on the program that I use to upload to YouTube. And so I decided to cut that one short and then do the last part now. So this is going to be the official last video. The other one was just enough, so I have enough space to record this one and upload it without any issues. With that said, we did stop at a nice place to stop, and that is just before Aphorism 1003. And that's because this one is called Section 2, or Part 2, named Dionysus. So I believe there's another section after this which talks about the eternal return, but that one's very, very short. So with that said, by my Kindle edition that I'm using, we are 90% of the way there. And with that said, I will go ahead and get started with Aphorism 1003. To him who is one of nature's lucky strokes, to him unto whom my heart goes out, to him who is carved from one integral block, which is hard, sweet, and fragrant, to him from whom even my nose can derive some pleasure, let this book be dedicated. He enjoys that which is beneficial to him. His pleasure in anything ceases when the limits of what is beneficial to him are overstepped. He divines the remedies for partial injuries. His illnesses are the great stimulants of his existence. He understands how to exploit his serious accidents. He grows stronger under the misfortune which threatened to annihilate him. He instinctively gathers from all he sees, hears, and experiences the materials for what concerns him most. He pursues a selective principle. He rejects a good deal. He reacts with that tardiness which long caution and deliberate pride have bred in him. He tests the stimulus. Whence does it come? Whither does it lead? He does not submit. He is always in his own company, whether his intercourse be with books, with men, or with nature. He honors anything by choosing it, by conceding to it, by trusting it. 1004. We should attain to such a height, to such a lofty eagle's ledge in our observation, as to be able to understand that everything happens just as it ought to happen, and that all quote-unquote imperfection and the pain it brings belong to all that which is most eminently desirable. 1005. Towards 1876, I experienced a fright, for I saw that everything I had most wished for up to that time was being compromised. I realized this when I perceived what Wagner was actually driving at, and I was bound very fast to him by all the bonds of a profound similarity of needs, by gratitude, by the thought that he could not be replaced, and by the absolute void which I saw facing me. Just about this time I believed myself to be inextricably entangled in my philology and my professorship, in the accident and last shift of my life. I did not know how to get out of it, and I was tired, used up, and on my last legs. At about the same time, I realized that what my instincts most desired to attain was precisely the reverse of what Schopenhauer's instincts wanted. That is to say, a justification of life, even where it was most terrible, most equivocal, and most false. To this end I had the formula Dionysian in my hand. Schopenhauer's interpretation of the absolute as will was certainly a step toward that concept of the absolute which is supposed to be necessarily good, blessed, true, and integral. But Schopenhauer did not understand how to deify this will. He remained suspended in the moral Christian ideal. Indeed, he was still so very much under the dominion of Christian values that once he could no longer regard the absolute as God, he had to conceive it as evil, foolish, utterly reprehensible. He did not realize that there is an infinite number of ways of being different, and even of being God. 1006. Hitherto, moral values have been the highest values. Does anybody doubt this? If we bring down the values from their pedestal, we thereby alter all values. The principle of the order of rank which has prevailed hitherto is thus overthrown. 1007. Transvalue values. What does this mean? It implies that all spontaneous motives, all new, future, and strong motives are still extant, but that they will now appear under false names and false valuations, and have not yet become conscious of themselves. We ought to have the courage to become conscious, and to affirm all that which has been attained, to get rid of the humdrum character of old valuations, which makes us unworthy of the best and strongest things that we have achieved. 1008. Any doctrine would be superfluous for which everything is not already prepared in the way of accumulated forces and explosive material. A transvaluation of values can only be accomplished when there is a tension of new needs, and a new set of needy people who feel all old values as painful, although they are not conscious of what is wrong. 1009. The standpoint from which my values are determined, is abundance or desire active? Is one a mere spectator, or is one's own shoulder at the wheel? Is one looking away, or is one turning aside? Is one acting spontaneously as the result of accumulated strength, or is one merely reacting to a goad or to a stimulus? Is one simply acting as the result of a paucity of elements, or of such an overwhelming dominion over a host of elements that this power enlists the latter into its service if it requires them? Is one a problem oneself, or is one a solution already? Is one perfect through the smallness of the task, or imperfect owing to the extraordinary character of the aim? Is one genuine, or only an actor? Is one genuine as an actor, or only the bad copy of an actor? Is one a representative, or the creature represented? Is one a personality, or merely a rendezvous of personalities? Is one ill from a disease, or from surplus health? Does one lead as a shepherd, or as an quote-unquote exception? Third alternative, as a fugitive. Is one in need of dignity, or can one play the clown? Is one in search of resistance, or is one evading it? Is one imperfect owing to one's precocity, or to one's tardiness? Is it one's nature to say yea or no, or is one a peacock's tail of garish parts? Is one proud enough not to feel ashamed even of one's vanity? Is one still able to feel a bite of conscience? This species is becoming rare. Formerly conscience had to bite too often. It is as if it now no longer had enough teeth to do so. Is one still capable of a duty? There are some people who would lose the whole joy of their lives if they were deprived of their duty. This holds good especially of feminine creatures who are born subjects. 1010. Supposing our common comprehension of the universe were a misunderstanding, would it be possible to conceive of a form of perfection within the limits of which even such a misunderstanding as this could be sanctioned? The concept of a new form of perfection, that which does not correspond to our logic, to our beauty, to our good, to our truth, might be perfect in a higher sense even than our ideal is. 1011. Our most important limitation. We must not deify the unknown. We are just beginning to know so little. The false and wasted endeavors. Our quote-unquote new world. We must ascertain to what extent we are the creators of our valuations. We will thus be able to put sense into history. This belief in truth is reaching its final logical conclusion in us. Ye know how it reads, that if there is anything at all that must be worshipped, it is appearance, that falsehood and not truth is divine. 1012. He who urges rational thought forward thereby also drives its antagonistic power, mysticism and foolery of every kind, to new feats of strength. We should recognize that every movement is, 1. Partly the manifestation of fatigue resulting from a previous movement, satiety after it, the malice of weakness towards it, and disease, and 2. Partly a new awakened accumulation of long slumbering forces, and therefore wanton, violent, healthy. 1013. Health and morbidness. Let us be careful. The standard is the bloom of the body, the agility, courage, and cheerfulness of the mind, but also, of course, how much morbidness a man can bear and overcome, and convert into health. That which would send more delicate natures to the dogs belongs to the stimulating means of great health. 1014. It is only a question of power, to have all the morbid traits of the century, but to balance them by means of overflowing, plastic, and rejuvenating power, the strong man. 1015. Concerning the strength of the 19th century. We are more medieval than the 18th century, not only more inquisitive or more susceptible to the strange and to the rare. We have revolted against the revolution. We have freed ourselves from the fear of reason, which was the specter of the 18th century. We once more dare to be childish, lyrical, absurd. In a word, we are musicians, and we are just as little frightened of the ridiculous as of the absurd. The devil finds that he is tolerated even by God. Better still, he has become interesting as one who has been misunderstood and slandered for ages. We are the saviors of the devil's honor. We no longer separate the great from the terrible. We reconcile good things in all their complexity with the very worst things. We have overcome the desideratum of the past, which wanted goodness to grow without the increase of evil. The cowardice towards the ideal, peculiar to the Renaissance, has diminished. We even dare to aspire to the latter's morality. Intolerance towards priests and the Church has at the same time come to an end. It is immoral to believe in God. But this is precisely what we regard as the best possible justification of this belief. On all these things we have conferred the civic rights of our minds. We do not tremble before the backside of good things. We even look for it. We are brave and inquisitive enough for that. Of Greek antiquity, of morality, of reason, of good taste. For instance, we reckon up the losses which we incur with all this treasure. We almost reduce ourselves to poverty with such a treasure. Neither do we conceal the backside of evil things from ourselves. 1016. That which does us honor. If anything does us honor, it is this. We have transferred our seriousness to other things. All those things which have been despised and laid aside as base by all ages, we regard as important. On the other hand, we surrender fine feelings at a cheap rate. Could any aberration be more dangerous than the contempt of the body? As if all intellectuality were not thereby condemned to become morbid, and to take refuge in the vapors of idealism. Nothing that has been thought out by Christians and idealists holds water. We are more radical. We have discovered the smallest world everywhere as the most decisive. The paving stones in the streets, good air in our rooms, food understood according to its worth. We value all the necessaries of life seriously, and despise all beautiful soulfulness as a form of levity and frivolity. That which has been most despised hitherto is now pressed into the front rank. 1017. In the place of Rousseau's Man of Nature, the 19th century has discovered a much more genuine image of man. It had the courage to do this. On the whole, the Christian concept of man has in a way been reinstalled. What we have not had the courage to do was to call precisely this man par excellence good, and to see the future of mankind guaranteed in him. In the same way, we did not dare to regard the growth and the terrible side of man's character as an accompanying feature of every advance in culture. In this sense, we are still under the influence of the Christian ideal, and side with it against paganism, and likewise against the Renaissance concept of virtue. But the key of culture is not to be found in this way. and in praxi we still have the forgeries of history in favor of the good man, as if he alone constituted the progress of humanity, and the socialistic ideal, i.e., the residue of Christianity and of Rousseau and the de-Christianized world. The fight against the 18th century. It meets with its greatest conquerors in Goethe and Napoleon. Schopenhauer, too, fights against the 18th century, but he returns involuntarily to the 17th. He is a modern Pascal, with Pascalian valuations, without Christianity. Schopenhauer was not strong enough to invent a new yea. Napoleon. We see the necessary relationship between the higher and the terrible man. Quote-unquote man reinstalled, and her due of contempt and fear restored to woman. Highest activity and health are the signs of the great man, the straight line and grand style rediscovered in action, the mightiest of all instincts, that of life itself, the lust of dominion, heartily welcomed. 1018. Revue des Deux Mondes, 15th February, 1887. Taine, concerning Napoleon. Quote, suddenly, the master faculty reveals itself. The artist, which was latent in the politician, comes forth from his scabbard. He creates dans l'idéal et l'impossible. He is once more recognized as that which he is, the posthumous brother of Dante and of Michelangelo, and verily, in view of the definite contours of his vision, the intensity, the coherence and inner consistency of his dream, the depth of his meditations, the superhuman greatness of his conception, he is their equal. His genius has the same cut and the same structure. He is one of the three sovereign spirits of the Italian Renaissance. Nota bene, Dante, Michelangelo, Napoleon. 1019. Concerning the pessimism of strength and the internal economy of the primitive man's soul, the fear of evil preponderates. What is evil? Three kinds of things: accident, uncertainty, the unexpected. How does primitive man combat evil? He conceives it as a thing of reason, of power, even as a person. By this means he is enabled to make treaties with it, and generally to operate upon it in advance, to forestall it. Another expedient is to declare its evil and harmful character to be but apparent, the consequence of accidental occurrences and of uncertainty and the unexpected, are interpreted as well meant, as reasonable. A third means is to interpret evil above all as merited. Evil is thus justified as a punishment. In short, man submits to, in all religious and moral interpretations, are but forms of submission to evil. The belief that a good purpose lies behind all evil implies the renunciation of any desire to combat it. Now, the history of every culture shows a diminution of this fear of the accidental, of the uncertain, and of the unexpected. Culture means precisely to learn to reckon, to discover causes, to acquire the power of forestalling events, to acquire a belief in necessity. With the growth of culture, man is able to dispense with that primitive form of submission to evil, called religion or morality, and that justification of evil. Now he wages war against quote-unquote evil. He gets rid of it. Yes, a state of security of belief in law and the possibility of calculation is possible, in which consciousness regards these things with tedium, in which the joy of the accidental, of the uncertain, and of the unexpected actually becomes a spur. Let us halt a moment before this symptom of highest culture. I call it the pessimism of strength. Man now no longer requires a justification of evil. Justification is precisely what he abhors. He enjoys evil per cru. He regards purposeless evil as the most interesting kind of evil. If he had required a god in the past, he now delights in cosmic disorder without a god, a world of accident, to the essence of which terror, ambiguity, and seductiveness belong. In a state of this sort, it is precisely goodness which requires to be justified. That is to say, it must either have an evil and a dangerous basis, or else it must contain a vast amount of stupidity, in which case it still pleases. Animality no longer awakens terror now. A very intellectual and happy wanton spirit in favor of the animal and man is, in such periods, the most triumphant form of spirituality. Man is now strong enough to be able to feel ashamed of a belief in God. He may now play the part of the devil's advocate afresh. If in practice he pretends to uphold virtue, it will be for those reasons which lead virtue to be associated with subtlety, cunning, lust of gain, and a form of the lust of power. This pessimism of strength also ends in a theodicy, i.e., in an absolute saying of yea to the world, that the same arguments will be raised in favor of life, which formerly were raised against it, and in this way, and a conception of this world as the highest ideal possible, which has been effectively attained. 1020. The principal kinds of pessimism. The pessimism of sensitiveness, excess irritability with a preponderance of the feelings of pain. The pessimism of the will that is not free. Otherwise expressed, the lack of resisting power against stimuli. The pessimism of doubt, shyness in regard to everything fixed, in regard to all grasping and touching. The psychological conditions which belong to these different kinds of pessimism may all be observed in a lunatic asylum, even though they are found in a slightly exaggerated form. The same applies to nihilism, the penetrating feeling of nonentity. What, however, is the nature of Pascal's moral pessimism and the metaphysical pessimism of the Vedanta philosophy? What is the nature of the social pessimism of anarchists, as of Shelley, and of the pessimism of compassion, like that of Leo Tolstoy and Alfred de Vigny? Are all these things not also the phenomena of decay and sickness? And is not excessive seriousness in regard to moral values, or in regard to other world fictions, or social calamities, or suffering in general, of the same order? All such exaggeration of a single and narrow standpoint is in itself a sign of sickness. The same applies to the preponderance of a negative over an affirmative attitude. In this respect we must not confound with the above. The joy of saying and doing no, which is the result of the enormous power and tenseness of an affirmative attitude, peculiar to all rich and mighty men and ages. It is, as it were, a luxury, a form of courage, too, which opposes the terrible, which has sympathy with the frightful and the questionable, because, among other things, one is terrible and questionable, the Dionysian in will, intellect, and taste. 1021. My 5 no's. 1. My fight against the feeling of sin and the introduction of the notion of punishment in the physical and metaphysical world, likewise into psychology and the interpretation of history. The recognition of the fact that all philosophies and valuations hitherto have been saturated with morality. 2. My identification and my discovery of the traditional ideal, of the Christian ideal, even where the dogmatic form of Christianity has been wrecked. The danger of the Christian ideal resides in its valuations, in that which can dispense with concrete expression. My struggle against latent Christianity, for instance in music and socialism. 3. My struggle against the 18th century of Rousseau, against his quote-unquote nature, against his good man, his belief in the dominion of feeling, against the pampering, weakening, and moralizing of man, an ideal born of the hatred of aristocratic culture, which in practice is the dominion of unbridled feelings of resentment, and invented as a standard for the purpose of war. The Christian morality of the feeling of sin, as well as the morality of resentment, is an attitude of the mob. 4. My fight against Romanticism, in which the ideals of Christianity and of Rousseau converge, but which possesses at the same time a yearning for that antiquity which knew of sacerdotal and aristocratic culture, a yearning for virtù, and for the strong man, something extremely hybrid, a false and imitated kind of stronger humanity which appreciates extreme conditions in general and sees the symptom of strength in them, the cult of passion, an imitation of the most expressive forms, furor espressivo, originating not out of plenitude, but out of want. In the 19th century, there are some things which are born out of the relative plenitude, i.e., out of well-being, cheerful music, etc. Among poets, for instance, Stifter and Gottfried Keller give signs of more strength and inner well-being than blank. The great strides of engineering, of inventions, of the natural sciences, and of history, are relative products of the strength and self-reliance of the 19th century. 5. My struggle against the predominance of gregarious instincts, now science makes common cause with them, against the profound hate with which every kind of order of rank and of aloofness is treated. 1022. From the pressure of plenitude, from the tension of forces that are continually increasing within us, and which cannot yet discharge themselves, a condition is produced which is very similar to that which precedes a storm. We, like nature's sky, become overcast. That, too, is pessimism, a teaching which puts an end to such a condition by the fact that it commands something, a transvaluation of values, by means of which the accumulated forces are given a channel, a direction, so that they explode into deeds and flashes of lightning, does not in the least require to be a hedonistic teaching, insofar as it releases strength which was compressed to an agonizing degree. It brings happiness. 1023. Pleasure appears with a feeling of power. Happiness means that the consciousness of power and triumph has begun to prevail. Progress is the strengthening of the type, the ability to exercise great willpower. Everything else is a misunderstanding and a danger. 1024. There comes a time when the old masquerade and moral togging up of the passions provokes repugnance, naked nature, when the quanta of power are recognized as decidedly simple, as determining rank, when grand style appears again as the result of great passion. 1025. The purpose of culture would have us enlist everything terrible, step by step and experimentally, into its service. But before it is strong enough for this, it must combat, moderate, mask, and even curse everything terrible. Wherever a culture points to anything as evil, it betrays its fear and therefore weakness. Thesis. Everything good is the evil of yore which has been rendered serviceable. Standard. The more terrible and the greater the passions may be which an age, a people, and an individual are at liberty to possess, because they are able to use them as a means, the higher is their culture. The more mediocre, weak, submissive, and cowardly a man may be, the more things he will regard as evil. According to him, the kingdom of evil is the largest. The lowest man will see the kingdom of evil, i.e., that which is forbidden him and which is hostile to him, everywhere. 1026. It is not a fact that happiness follows virtue, but it is the mighty man who first declares his happy state to be virtue. Evil actions belong to the mighty and the virtuous. Bad and base actions belong to the subjected. The mightiest man, the creator, would have to be the most evil, inasmuch as he makes his ideal prevail over all men in opposition to their ideals, and remolds them according to his own image. Evil, in this respect, means hard, painful, and forced. Such men as Napoleon must always return and always settle our belief in the self-glory of the individual afresh. He himself, however, was corrupted by the means he had to stoop to, and had lost noblesse of character. If he had had to prevail among another kind of men, he could have availed himself of other means, and thus it would not seem necessary that a Caesar must become bad. 1027. Man is a combination of the beast and the superbeast. Higher man a combination of the monster and the superman. These opposites belong to each other. With every degree of a man's growth towards greatness and loftiness, he also grows downwards into the depths and into the terrible. We should not desire the one without the other, or, better still, the more fundamentally we desire the one, the more completely we shall achieve the other. 1028. Terribleness belongs to greatness. Let us not deceive ourselves. 1029. I have taught the knowledge of such terrible things that all, quote, Epicurean contentment, end quote, is impossible concerning them. Dionysian pleasure is the only adequate kind here. I was the first to discover the tragic. Thanks to their superficiality in ethics, the Greeks misunderstood it. Resignation is not the lesson of tragedy, but only the misunderstanding of it. The yearning for nonentity is the denial of tragic wisdom, its opposite. 1030. A rich and powerful soul not only gets over painful, even terrible losses, deprivations, robberies, and insults, it actually leaves such dark infernos in possession of still greater plenitude and power, and, what is most important of all, in possession of an increased blissfulness and love. I believe that he who has divined something of the most fundamental conditions of love will understand Dante for having written over the door of his Inferno, quote, I also am the creation of eternal love. End quote. 1031. To have traveled over the whole circumference of the modern soul, and to have sat in all its corners, my ambition, my torment, and my happiness. Veritably, to have overcome pessimism, and as the result thereof, to have acquired the eyes of Goethe, full of love and goodwill. 1032. The first question is by no means whether we are satisfied with ourselves, but whether we are satisfied with anything at all. Granting that we should say yea to any single moment, we have then affirmed not only ourselves, but the whole of existence. For nothing stands by itself, either in us or in other things. And if our soul has vibrated and rung with happiness, like a chord, once only and only once, then all eternity was necessary in order to bring about that one event. And all eternity and this single moment of our affirmation was called good, was saved, justified, and blessed. 1033. The passions which say yea. I ride, happiness, health, the love of the sexes, hostility and war, reverence, beautiful attitudes, manners, strong will, the discipline of the lofty, spirituality, the will to power, and gratitude to the earth and to life. All that is rich, that would fain bestow, and that refreshes, gilds, immortalizes, and deifies life. The whole power of the virtues that glorify, all declaring things good, saying yea, and doing yea. 1034. We, many a few who once more dare to live in a world purged of morality, we pagans in faith, we are probably also the first to understand what a pagan faith is, to be obliged to imagine higher creatures than man, but to imagine them beyond good and evil, to be compelled to value all the higher existence as immoral existence. We believed in Olympus and not in the man on the cross. 1035. The more modern man has exercised his idealizing power in regard to a god, mostly by moralizing the latter, ever more and more. What does that mean? Nothing good, a diminution in man's strength. As a matter of fact, the reverse would be possible, and indications of this are not wanting. God imagined as emancipation from morality, comprising the whole of the abundant assembly of life's contrasts, and saving and justifying them in a divine agony. God as the beyond, the superior elevation, to the wretched cul-de-sac, morality of good and evil. 1036. A humanitarian God cannot be demonstrated from the world that is known to us. So much are ye driven in force to conclude today. But what conclusion do ye draw from this? He cannot be demonstrated to us, the skepticism of knowledge. You all fear the conclusion. From the world that is known to us quite a different God would be demonstrable, such a one as would certainly not be humanitarian. And in a word, you cling fast to your God and invent a world for him which is unknown to us. 1037. Let us banish the highest good from our concept of God. It is unworthy of a God. Let us likewise banish the highest wisdom. It is the vanity of philosophers who have perpetrated the absurdity of a God who is a monster of wisdom. The idea was to make him as like them as possible. No, God is the highest power. That is sufficient. Everything follows from that, even the world. 1038. And how many new gods are not still possible? I myself, in whom the religious, that is to say the God-creating instincts, occasionally becomes active at the most inappropriate moments, how very differently the divine has revealed itself every time to me. So many strange things have passed before me in those timeless moments which fall into man's life as if they came from the moon, and in which he absolutely no longer knows how old he is or how young he still may be. I would not doubt that there are several kinds of gods. Some are not wanting which one could not possibly imagine without a certain halcyonic calm and levity. Light feet perhaps belong to the concept God. Is it necessary to explain that a God knows how to hold himself preferably outside all Philistine and rationalist circles? Also between ourselves, beyond good and evil? His outlook is a free one, as Goethe would say. And to invoke the authority of Zarathustra, which cannot be too highly appreciated in this regard. Zarathustra goes as far as to confess, I would only believe in a God who knew how to dance. Again I say, how many new gods are not still possible? Certainly Zarathustra himself is merely an old atheist. He believes neither in old nor in new gods. Zarathustra says he would, but Zarathustra will not. Take care to understand him well. The type God conceived according to the type of creative spirits, of great men. 1039. And how many new ideals are not at bottom still possible? Here is a little ideal that I seize upon every 5 weeks, while upon a wild and lonely walk, in the azure moment of a blasphemous joy. To spend one's life amid delicate and absurd things, a stranger to reality, half artist, half bird, half metaphysician, without a yea or a nay for reality, save that from time to time one acknowledges it, after the manner of a good dancer, with the tips of one's toes, always tickled by some happy ray of sunlight, relieved and encouraged even by sorrow, for sorrow preserves the happy man, fixing a little tale of jokes even to the most holy thing. This, as is clear, is the ideal of a heavy spirit, a ton in weight of the spirit of gravity. 1040. From the military school of the soul, dedicated to the brave, the good-humored, and the abstinent. I should not like to undervalue the amiable virtues, but greatness of soul is not compatible with them. Even in the arts, grand style excludes all merely pleasing qualities. In times of painful tension and vulnerability, choose war. War hardens and develops muscle. Those who have been deeply wounded have the Olympian laughter. A man only has what he needs. It has now already lasted 10 years. No sound any longer reaches me. A land without rain. A man must have a vast amount of humanity at his disposal in order not to pine away in such a drought. 1041. My new road to an affirmative attitude. Philosophy, as I have understood it and lived it up to the present, is the voluntary quest of the repulsive and atrocious aspects of existence. From the long experience derived from such wandering over ice and desert, I learnt to regard quite differently everything that had been philosophized hitherto. The concealed history of philosophy, the psychology of its great names came into the light for me. How much truth can a spirit endure? For how much truth is it daring enough? This for me was the real measure of value. Error is a piece of cowardice. Every victory on the part of knowledge is the result of courage. of hardness towards oneself, of cleanliness towards oneself. The kind of experimental philosophy which I am living even anticipates the possibility of the most fundamental nihilism on principle. But by this I do not mean that it remains standing at a negation, at a no or at a will to negation. It would rather attain to the very reverse, to a Dionysian affirmation of the world as it is, without subtraction, exception, or choice. It would have eternal circular motion, the same things, the same reasoning, and the same illogical concatenation. The highest state to which a philosopher can attain, to maintain a Dionysian attitude to life. My formula for this is amor fati. To this end we must not only consider those aspects of life which have been denied hitherto as necessary, but as desirable, and not only desirable to those aspects which have been affirmed hitherto, as complements or first prerequisites, so to speak, but for their own sake, as the more powerful, more terrible, and more veritable aspects of life, in which the latter's will expresses itself most clearly. To this end we must also value that aspect of existence which alone has been affirmed until now. We must understand whence this valuation arises, and to how slight an extent it has to do with a Dionysian valuation of life. I selected and understood that which in this respect says yea, on the one hand, the instinct of the sufferer, on the other, the gregarious instinct, and thirdly, the instinct of the greater number against the exceptions. Thus I divine to what extent a stronger kind of man must necessarily imagine the elevation and enhancement of man in another direction. Higher creatures, beyond good and evil, beyond those values which bear the stamp of their origin in the sphere of suffering, of the herd, and of the greater number. I searched for the data of this topsy-turvy formation of ideals in history. The concepts pagan, classical, noble have been discovered afresh and brought forward. 1042. We should demonstrate to what extent the religion of the Greeks was higher than Judeo-Christianity. The latter triumphed because the Greek religion was degenerate and decadent. 1043. It is not surprising that a couple of centuries have been necessary in order to link up again. A couple of centuries are very little indeed. 1044. There must be some people who sanctify functions, not only eating and drinking, and not only in memory of them, or in harmony with them, but this world must be forever glorified anew, and in a novel fashion. 1045. The most intellectual men feel the ecstasy and charm of sensual things in a way which other men, those with fleshy hearts, cannot possibly imagine, and ought not to be able to imagine. They are sensualist, with the best possible faith, because they grant the senses a more fundamental value than that fine sieve, that thinning and mincing machine, or whatever it is called, which in the language of the people is termed spirit. The strength and power of the senses is the most essential thing in a sound man who is one of nature's lucky strokes. The splendid beast must first be there, otherwise what is the value of all humanization? 1046. 1. We want to hold fast to our senses, and to the belief in them, and to accept their logical conclusions. The hostility to the senses in the philosophy that has been written up to the present has been man's greatest feat of nonsense. 2. The world now extant, on which all earthly and living things have so built themselves, that it now appears as it does, enduring and proceeding slowly, we would fain continue building, not criticize it away as false. 3. Our valuations help in the process of building. They emphasize and accentuate. What does it mean when the whole religion say, everything is bad and false and evil? This condemnation of the whole process can only be the judgment of the failures. 4. True, the failures might be the greatest sufferers, and therefore the most subtle. The contented might be worth little. 5. We must understand the fundamental artistic phenomenon which is called life, the formative spirit which constructs under the most unfavorable circumstances, and in the slowest manner possible. The proof of all its combinations must first be given afresh. It maintains itself. 1047. Sexuality, lust of dominion, the pleasure derived from appearance and deception, great and joyful gratitude to life and its typical conditions. These things are essential to all paganism, and it has a good conscience on its side. That which is hostile to nature, already in Greek antiquity, combats paganism in the form of morality and dialectics. 1040. An anti-metaphysical view of the world. Yes, but an artistic one. 1049. Apollo's misapprehension. The eternity of beautiful forms. The aristocratic prescription, thus shall it ever be. Dionysus. Sensuality and cruelty. The perishable nature of existence might be interpreted as the joy of procreative and destructive force, as unremitting creation. 1050. The word Dionysian expresses a constraint to unity, a soaring above personality, the commonplace, society, reality, and above the abyss of the ephemeral, the passionately painful sensation of superabundance in darker, fuller, and more fluctuating conditions, an ecstatic saying of yea to the collective character of existence, as that which remains the same and equally mighty and blissful throughout all change, the great pantheistic sympathy with pleasure and pain, which declares even the most terrible and the most questionable qualities of existence good, and sanctifies them. The eternal will to procreation, to fruitfulness, and to recurrence, the feeling of unity in regard to the necessity of creating and annihilating. The word Apollonian expresses the constraint to be absolutely isolated to the typical individual, to everything that simplifies, distinguishes, and makes strong, salient, definite, and typical to freedom within the law. The further development of art is just as necessarily bound up with the antagonism of these two natural art forces, as the further development of mankind is bound up with the antagonism of the sexes. The plenitude of power and restraint, the highest form of self-affirmation, in a cool, noble, and reserved kind of beauty. The Apollonianism of the Hellenic will. This antagonism of the Dionysian and of the Apollonian in the Greek soul is one of the great riddles which made me feel drawn to the essence of Hellenism. At bottom, I troubled about nothing save the solution of the question: why precisely Greek Apollonianism should have been forced to grow out of Dionysian soil. The Dionysian Greek had need of being Apollonian. That is to say, in order to break his will to the titanic, to the complex, to the uncertain, to the horrible by a will to measure, to simplicity, and to submission to rule and concept. Extravagance, wildness, and Asiatic tendencies lie at the root of the Greeks. Their courage consists in their struggle with their Asiatic nature. They were not given beauty any more than they were given logic and moral naturalness. In them these things are victories. They are willed and fought for. They constitute the triumph of the Greeks. 1051. It is clear that only the rarest and most lucky cases of humanity can attain to the highest and most sublime human joys in which life celebrates its own glorification. And this only happens when these rare creatures themselves and their forebears have lived a long preparatory life leading to this goal, without, however, having done so consciously. It is then that an overflowing wealth of multifarious forces and the most agile power of free will and lordly command exist together in perfect concord in one man. Then the intellect is just as much at ease or at home in the senses as the senses are at ease or at home in it. And everything that takes place in the latter must give rise to extraordinary subtle joys in the former, and vice versa. Just think of this vice versa for a moment in a man like Hafiz. Even Goethe, though to a lesser degree, gives some idea of this process. It is probable that in such perfect and well-constituted men, the most sensual functions are finally transfigured by a symbolic elatedness of the highest intellectuality, and themselves they feel a kind of deification of the body, and are most remote from the ascetic philosophy of the principle, God is a spirit. From this principle, it is clear that the ascetic is the botched man, who declares only that to be good and God which is absolute, and which judges and condemns. From that height of joy in which man feels himself completely and utterly a deified form and self-justification of nature, down to the joy of healthy peasants and healthy semi-human beasts, the whole of this long and enormous gradation of the light and color of happiness was called by the Greek, not without that grateful quivering of one who is initiated into the secret, not without much caution and pious silence, by the godlike name Dionysus. What then do all modern men, the children of a crumbling, multifarious, sick, and strange age, know of the compass of Greek happiness? How could they know anything about it? Whence would the slaves of modern ideas derive their right to Dionysian feasts? When the Greek body and soul were in full bloom, and not, as it were, in states of morbid exaltation and madness, there arose the secret symbol of the loftiest affirmation and transfiguration of life and the world that has ever existed. There we have a standard beside which everything that has grown since must seem too short, too poor, too narrow. If we but pronounce the word Dionysus in the presence of the best of more recent names and things, in the presence of Goethe, for instance, or Beethoven, or Shakespeare, or Raphael, in a trice we realize that our best things and moments are condemned. Dionysus is a judge. Am I understood? There can be no doubt that the Greeks sought to interpret, by means of their Dionysian experiences, the final mysteries of the destiny of the soul, and everything they knew concerning the education and the purification of man, and above all concerning the absolute hierarchy and inequality of value between man and God. There is the deepest experience of all Greeks, which they conceal beneath great silence. We do not know the Greeks so long as this hidden and subterranean access to them remains obstructed. The indiscreet eyes of scholars will never perceive anything in these things, however much learned energy may still have to be expended in the service of this excavation. Even the noble zeal of such friends of antiquity as Goethe and Winckelmann seem to savor somewhat of bad form and of arrogance, precisely in this respect. To wait and to prepare oneself, to await the appearance of new sources of knowledge, to prepare oneself in solitude for the sight of new faces and the sound of new voices, to cleanse one's soul ever more and more of the dust and noise as of a country fair, which is peculiar to this age, to overcome everything Christian by something super-Christian, and not only to rid oneself of it, for the Christian doctrine is the counter-doctrine of the Dionysian, to rediscover the south in oneself, and to stretch a clear, glittering, and mysterious southern sky above one, to reconquer the southern healthiness and concealed power of the soul, once more for oneself, to increase the compass of one's soul step by step, and to become more supranational, more European, more super-European, more Oriental, and finally more Hellenic. For Hellenism was, as a matter of fact, the first great union and synthesis of everything Oriental, and precisely on that account, the beginning of the European soul, the discovery of our New World. He who lives under such imperatives, who knows what he may not encounter some day, possibly a new dawn. 1052. The two types, Dionysus and Christ on the cross. We should ascertain whether the typically religious man is a decadent phenomenon. The great innovators are one and all morbid and epileptic, but do not let us forget to include that type of the religious man who is pagan. Is the pagan cult not a form of gratitude for and affirmation of life? Ought not its most representative type to be an apology and deification of life? The type of well-constituted and ecstatically overflowing spirit? The type of a spirit which absorbs the contradictions and problems of existence, which solves them? At this point I set up the Dionysus of the Greeks, the religious affirmation of life, of the whole of life, not of denied and partial life. It is typical that in this cult of the sexual act awakens ideas of depth, mystery, and reverence. Dionysus versus quote-unquote Christ. Here you have the contrast. It is not a difference in regard to the martyrdom, but the latter has a different meaning. Life itself, life's eternal fruitfulness and recurrence caused anguish, destruction, and the will to annihilation. In the other case, the suffering of the Christ as the innocent one stands as an objection against life. It is the formula of life's condemnation. Readers will guess that the problem concerns the meaning of suffering, whether a Christian or a tragic meaning be given to it. In the first case, it is the road to a holy mode of existence. In the second case, existence itself is regarded as sufficiently holy to justify an enormous amount of suffering. The tragic man says yea, even to the most excruciating suffering. He is sufficiently strong, rich, and capable of deifying to be able to do this. The Christian denies even the happy lot on earth. He is weak, poor, and disinherited enough to suffer from life in any form. God on the cross is a curse upon life, a signpost directing people to deliver themselves from it. Dionysus cut into pieces is a promise of life. It will be forever born anew and rise afresh from destruction. Part 3. Eternal Recurrence. 1053. My philosophy reveals the triumphant thought through which all other systems of thought must ultimately perish. It is the great disciplinary thought. Those races that cannot bear it are doomed. Those which regard it as the greatest blessing are destined to rule. 1054. The greatest of all fights, for this purpose a new weapon is required. A hammer, a terrible alternative must be created. Europe must be brought face to face with the logic of facts and confronted with the question whether its will for ruin is really earnest. General leveling down to mediocrity must be avoided. Rather than this, it would be preferable to perish. 1055. A pessimistic attitude of mind and a pessimistic doctrine and ecstatic nihilism may in certain circumstances even prove indispensable to the philosopher. That is to say, as a mighty form of pressure or hammer with which he can smash up degenerate, perishing races and put them out of existence, with which he can beat a track to a new order of life, or instill a longing for a non-entity in those who are degenerate and who desire to perish. 1056. I wish to teach the thought which gives unto many the right to cancel their existences, the great disciplinary thought. 1057. Eternal Recurrence, a Prophecy. 1. The exposition of the doctrine and its theoretical first principles and results. 2. The proof of the doctrine. 3. Probable results which will follow from its being believed. It makes everything break open. A. The meaning of enduring it. B. The means of ignoring it. 4. Its place in history is a means. The period of greatest danger, the foundation of an oligarchy above peoples and their interests, education directed at establishing a political policy for humanity in general, a counterpart to Jesuitism. 1058. The two greatest philosophical points of view, both discovered by Germans, A. That of becoming and that of evolution, B. That based upon the values of existence, but the wretched form of German pessimism must first be overcome. Both points of view reconciled by me in a decisive manner. Everything becomes and returns forever. Escape is impossible. Granted that we could appraise the value of existence, what would be the result of it? The thought of recurrence is a principle of selection in the service of power and barbarity. The ripeness of man for this thought. 1059. 1. The thought of eternal recurrence, its first principles, which must necessarily be true if it were true, what its result is. 2. It is the most oppressive thought, its probable results, provided it not be prevented, that is to say, provided all values be not transvalued. 3. the means of enduring it, the transvaluation of all values. Pleasure no longer to be found in certainty, but in uncertainty, no longer cause and effect, but continual creativeness, no longer the will to self-preservation, but to power, no longer the modest expression, "It is all only subjective," but "It is all our work. Let us be proud of it." 1060. In order to endure the thought of recurrence, freedom from morality is necessary. New means against the fact pain regarded as the instrument, as the father of pleasure. There is no accretive consciousness of pain. Pleasure derived from all kinds of uncertainty and tentativeness as a counterpoise to extreme fatalism, suppression of the concept necessity, suppression of the will, suppression of absolute knowledge. Greatest elevation of man's consciousness of strength as that which creates Superman. 1061. The two extremes of thought, the materialistic and the Platonic, are reconciled in eternal recurrence. Both are regarded as ideals. 1062. If the universe had a goal, that goal would have been reached by now. If any sort of unforeseen final state existed, that state also would have been reached. If it were capable of any halting or stability of any being, it would have only possessed this capability of becoming stable for one instant in its development. And again becoming would have been at the end for ages, and with it all thinking and all quote-unquote spirit. The fact of quote-unquote intellects being in a state of development proves that the universe can have no goal, no final state, and is inescapable of being. But the old habit of thinking of some purpose in regard to all phenomena, and of thinking of a directing and creating deity in regard to the universe, is so powerful that the thinker has to go to great pains in order to avoid thinking of the very aimlessness of the world as intended. The idea that the universe intentionally evades a goal, and even knows artificial means wherewith it prevents itself from falling into a circular movement, must occur to all those who would fain attribute to the universe the capacity of eternally regenerating itself. That is to say, they would fain impose upon a finite, definite force, which is invariable in quantity, like the universe, the miraculous gift of renewing its forms and its conditions for all eternity. Although the universe is no longer a god, it must still be capable of the divine power of creating and transforming. It must forbid itself to relapse into any one of its previous forms. It must not only have the intention, but also the means of avoiding any sort of repetition, every second of its existence. Even it must control every single one of its movements, with a view of avoiding goals, final states, and repetitions, and all the other results of such an unpardonable and insane method of thought and desire. All this is nothing more than the old religious mode of thought and desire, which, in spite of all, longs to believe that in some way or other the universe resembles the old, beloved, infinite, and infinitely creative God, that in some way or other the old God still lives, that longing of Spinoza's, which is expressed in the words Deus sive natura, what he really felt was natura sive Deus, which then is the proposition and belief in which the decisive change, the present preponderance of the scientific spirit over the religious and God-fancying spirit is best formulated. Ought it not to be? The universe, as forced, must not be thought of as unlimited, because it cannot be thought of in this way. We forbid ourselves the concept infinite force, because it is incompatible with the idea of force. Whence it follows that the universe lacks the power of eternal renewal. 1063. The principle of the conservation of energy inevitably involves eternal recurrence. 1064. That a state of equilibrium has never been reached proves that it is impossible, but in infinite space it must have been reached. Likewise, in spherical space, the form of space must be the cause of the eternal movement, and ultimately of all imperfection. That energy and stability and immutability are contradictory. The measure of energy, dimensionally, is fixed, though it is essentially fluid. That which is timeless must be refuted. Any given moment of energy, the absolute conditions for a new distribution of all forces are present. It cannot remain stationary. Change is part of its essence, therefore time is as well. By this means, however, the necessity of change has only been established once more in theory. 1065. A certain emperor always bore the fleeting nature of all things in his mind in order not to value them too seriously, and to be able to live quietly in their midst. Conversely, everything seems to me much too important for it to be so fleeting. I seek an eternity for everything. Ought one to pour the most precious salves and wines into the sea? My consolation is that everything that has been is eternal. The sea will wash it up again. 1066. The new concept of the universe. The universe exists. It is nothing that grows into existence and that passes out of existence. Or better still, it develops, it passes away, but it never began to develop and has never ceased from passing away. It maintains itself in both states. It lives on itself, its excrements are its nourishment. We need not concern ourselves for one instant with the hypothesis of a created world. The concept create is today utterly indefinable and unrealizable. It is but a word which hails from superstitious ages. Nothing can be explained with a word. The last attempt that was made to conceive of a world that began occurred quite recently, in many cases with the help of logical reasoning. Generally, too, as you will guess, with an ulterior theological motive. Several attempts have been made lately to show that the concept that the universe has an infinite past, regressus in infinitum, is contradictory. It was even demonstrated. It is true at the price of confounding the head with the tail. Nothing can prevent me from calculating backwards from this moment of time and saying, I shall never reach the end, just as I can calculate without end in a forward direction from the same moment. It is only when I wish to commit the error, I shall be careful to avoid it, of reconciling this correct concept of regressus in infinitum with the absolutely unrealizable concept of a finite progressus up to the present. Only when I consider the direction, forwards or backwards, as logically indifferent, that I take hold of the head this very moment and think I hold the tail. This pleasure I leave to you, Mr. During. I have come across this thought in other thinkers before me, and every time I found that it was determined by other ulterior motives, chiefly theological, in favor of a creator spiritus. If the universe were in any way able to congeal, to dry up, to perish, or if it were capable of attaining to a state of equilibrium, or if it had any kind of goal at all, which a long lapse of time, immutability, and finality reserved for it, in short, to speak metaphysically, if becoming could resolve itself into being or into non-entity, this state ought already to have been reached. But it has not been reached. It therefore follows. This is the only certainty we can grasp, which can serve as a corrective to a host of cosmic hypotheses, possible in themselves. If, for instance, materialism cannot consistently escape the conclusion of a finite state which William Thomson has traced out for it, then materialism is thereby refuted. If the universe may be conceived as a definite quantity of energy, as a definite number of centers of energy, and every other concept remains indefinite and therefore useless, it follows therefrom that the universe must go through a calculable number of combinations in the great game of chance which constitutes its existence. In infinity, at some moment or other, every possible combination must once have been realized. Not only this, but it must have been realized an infinite number of times. And inasmuch as between every one of these combinations and its next recurrence, every other possible combination would be necessarily have been undergone, and since every one of these combinations would determine the whole series in the same order, a circular movement of absolutely identical series is thus demonstrated. The universe is thus shown to be a circular movement, which has already repeated itself an infinite number of times, and which plays its game for all eternity. This conception is not simply materialistic, For if it were this, it would not involve an infinite recurrence of identical cases, but a finite state. Owing to the fact that the universe has not reached this finite state, materialism shows itself to be but an imperfect and provisional hypothesis. 1067. And do you know what the universe is to my mind? Shall I show it to you in my mirror? This universe is a monster of energy, without beginning or end, a fixed and brazen quantity of energy which grows neither bigger nor smaller, which does not consume itself, but only alters its face. As a whole, its bulk is immutable. It is a household without either losses or gains, but likewise without increase and without sources of revenue, surrounded by non-entity as by a frontier. It is nothing vague or wasteful. It does not stretch into infinity, but it is a definite quantum of energy, located in a limited space, and not in space which would be anywhere empty. It is rather energy everywhere. The play of forces and force waves, at the same time one and many, agglomerating here and diminishing there. A sea of forces storming and raging in itself, forever changing, forever rolling back over incalculable ages to recurrence, with an ebb and flow of its forms, producing the most complicated things out of the most simple structures, producing the most ardent, most savage, and most contradictory things out of the quietest, most rigid, and most frozen material, and then returning from multifariousness to uniformity, from the play of the contradictions back into the delight of consonance, saying yea unto itself even in this homogeneity of its courses and ages, forever blessing itself as something which recurs for all eternity, a becoming which knows not satiety or disgust or weariness. This, my Dionysian world of eternal self-creation, of eternal self-destruction, this mysterious world of twofold voluptuousness, this, my beyond good and evil without aim, unless there is an aim in the bliss of the circle, without will, unless a ring must be nature, keep good will to itself. Would you have a name for my world? A solution of all your riddles? Do ye also want a light, ye most concealed, strongest, and most undaunted men of the blackest midnight? This world is the will to power, and nothing else. And even ye yourselves are this will to power, and nothing besides. This is the end of The Will to Power, an attempted transvaluation of all values, by Friedrich Nietzsche. Thank you for listening.